Tonight, we are continuing the series of the Messianic tapes into the whole concept of Mashiach, and tonight's going to be a very important shiur because you're going to see the grand panoramic sweep, and you will learn very strange things tonight, very unusual things about the whole course of human history. There's a very critical question that we have to ask that is at the root of understanding what the whole Messianic period will be about. And essentially it's the following. If we ask ourselves, or rather if we ask the Torah, what is the basic or essential characteristic of the Yemos Mashiach, of the Messianic period, there will be a certain answer. The answer is that the Messianic period is different than the periods before it, like now, in one specific respect, and that is that in the Messianic times, meaning the Yemos Mashiach, the days of the Mashiach, the awareness and the perception and the sensitivity to the existence of God is on a much higher level. That's the critical difference between now and the time of Mashiach. What do I mean? It says a very important pasuk in the time of Mashiach, Umolo ha'oretz dei es Hashem, and the earth will be filled with knowledge of God, kamayim liyom mechasim, as the waters cover the sea. That's a very critical pasuk, because that pasuk tells us that in the time of Mashiach, the entire world, means every human being, man, woman, and child, will know that God exists, but will know it with such a certainty as if you see me in front of this room. That's how clear it will be to everyone in the world. Now this is a staggering concept. It is an incredibly amazing concept. That here in the world today we have so many atheists. We have whole nations which subscribe to atheism. Russia, China, and so on. We have many people in America, scientists, and many people, intellectuals, who don't believe in God at all. Atheists, agnostics, whatever the story is, that don't believe in God. And yet we see that there will come a time when the knowledge of the presence of God and existence will be without question. Now that's an incredible thing. It surely is. But that is the main feature of the Messianic period. It is not the fact that the Jews will go back to Israel. It is not the fact that they will no longer be in exile. All these things are secondary. What is critical is the elevation of human consciousness. Now the question that we all have to ask is, wait a minute, this sounds nice, but this sounds like something that in the end is against human opportunity, and it is contradictory to the very existence of man in this world. Why? What is the purpose of man in this world? Why is man in this world? Why? He's in this world so he has the opportunity of creating his own Olam Haba. He has the opportunity to create an eternal spiritual world where the knowledge, awareness of God is with absolute recognition. And that will be his simcha, and that will be his joy. And the reason why he's put in this world is so he should work. He should work with great efforts to achieving that awareness, so that he will be able to benefit from the fruits of his labor. Wait, if the reward is the awareness of God, then obviously the effort cannot be the awareness of God. If the reward of a man and the reward of a soul is that someday he will know every aspect of the Manisham in the sense that he can know it, and this will be his highest simcha, then his necessity to work for it cannot be in that kind of a period. That's the reward. In the period where he must work for it, it obviously has to be an environment where God is hidden and absent, where God hides and withdraws. And then God says to man, you find me and you bring me back. If you find me and you bring me back into your world, that will be your reward. And that is Olam Haba. So therefore we find that a world or an environment where man will experience his rewards is very different than the environment where man must experience the efforts or the labor to obtain that reward. If the reward is the clear, direct awareness of the Ribono Shel Olam, if that's the reward, then the time of effort or the period of effort cannot be a clear and direct perception of God. Can it? Of course not. God must be absent and withdrawn, and it's man who must work to bring him back. You see. That's clearly obvious. Because if man existed in a world where God was obvious and present, there would be no more free will. No more free will. There's nothing to work for anymore. Nothing to fight for. There's no Yetzer anymore to say go do what you want to do because there's nobody watching you. With that understanding, we have a very powerful question on the whole Messianic period. What is the Yemot Mashiach? The Yemot Mashiach is a period whose essential characteristic is the awareness of God. But wait a minute. That belongs to Olam Haba. That belongs to a future eternal life. That doesn't belong to what? To this physical world. And the Yemot Mashiach will take place on the physical world, on this planet. So we see that the Yemot Mashiach seems to have a factor or a feature which should belong to Olam Haba, not this world. In other words, the Yemot Mashiach must be a period where there is no more free will. And if there's such a period, why does that period belong to the physical universe? You see. Do we all understand this question? What I'm basically saying is not we would like to understand what the Mashiach is or why he's coming. But the question is, he doesn't belong here. The Mashiach doesn't belong here. We don't need a period of time when the knowledge of God on this physical world will become obvious. We don't need that, because that contradicts and confronts our free will. And that's not what the purpose of this world is all about. So either you have Olam Hazeh or you have Olam Haba. In Olam Hazeh, God is absent. In Olam Haba, God is present. And that's it. But the Mashiach, Yemot Mashiach, seems to be something in between, where God is present, and yet it's part of Olam Hazeh. Problem. Big problem. In order to answer that question, obviously, if we have such a question, we do not understand what the entire function of the Mashiach is. You see, we obviously don't, if we have such a question. So in order to answer that, let us look at the full scope of human history. And you're going to see very, very interesting structure. In order for us to answer the question, okay, let's look at the diagram essentially that I have here, and let's look into it. If you understand what I'm about to say in the way that I'm about to say it, you will understand the course of human history. Big word, isn't it? Adam Rishon. If you remember, what did we say about Adam Rishon, the first man? What was the purpose of the first man? Very simply, you remember we said that God created man to give him a great reward, that in order to give him this reward he wanted for him to work for it and not get it as a gift, that in order for him to get it by working for it, he put him into a place which God hides or conceals himself so that man would be forced in some way to bring God back. That's called the physical world. The purpose of Adam Rishon, the first man, was to bring God back into the world. If he would have succeeded in doing that by listening to the command of the Ribono Shel Olam, to the mitzvah of not eating of the Eitz Hadas, Tov Ra, he would have done an extraordinary thing. He would have removed the physical barrier to spirituality. He would have destroyed that which separates him from God forever. He would have destroyed it. He would have destroyed what's called the chesaron in the world. Chesaron means the imperfection. When God created the physical world, He created imperfectly. Imperfectly means that the physical world does not reflect the existence of the one who made it. That's what chesaron means. For God to make something, and for that object not to reflect that God made it, is an imperfection in that object. That is the essence of imperfection. The essence of perfection is that the object reflects who its creator is. So when God created the physical world, and the physical world does not reflect who made it, the physical world was made imperfectly. It is Adam's job to make that physical world perfect by creating a new world that would reflect the existence of God. I couldn't put it simpler. That is called Chasson. Chasson is a world which does not reflect the existence of its creator. It was the purpose of Adam to masakin the Chasson, what's called tikkun of the Chasson, to fix or to remove that imperfection. If he would have done that, he would have created, from that point in time, a world where the presence of God would have been obvious. That's called Olam Haba. What is the difference between a world of Chasson and a world of non-Chasson? I mean, rather, a world of Shlemus or perfection. The difference is very basically in how you perceive the Bnei Shalom. In a world which is perfect, that is a world where the awareness of God's existence pervades all reality. That is called a condition of what's known as Gilui Yehudo, or the revelation of God's presence or oneness. Very important words. Gilui Yehudoi. Gilui means revelation. Yehud means the unity or presence, His absolute presence of God, and that nothing else exists but God. A world which is perfect is a world which has the condition of Gilui Yehudo, or the revelation of His oneness. It was Adam's job to remove the chasson, or the imperfection, and restore the world to a complete condition of Gilui Yehudoi. That restoration, the removal of that imperfection, creates Olam Haba, or the future world. That is a world where there is total Gilui Yehudo, or the complete presence, or the complete revelation of God's presence. So, that's the essence of the matter. Very simple. The world of Adam, the physical world, the world he was put in his garden, the Garden of Eden, was created b'chasson. It was created imperfectly. Adam was asked to make it perfect. And the difference between perfection and imperfection has to do with the presence or absence of the awareness of God. Now the question is, to what extent was the world imperfect? To what extent was God's presence invisible? And the answer is, to a certain degree. There was a certain degree of God's absence. How much of that was there? Well, the answer is, and this is important, that when Adam was first created, if we say that we're talking about a ratio where the presence of God is symbolized by P, and the absence or withdrawal of God is symbolized by A, we would say that P was much bigger than A, means that the presence of God was much greater than his absence. So what we would say would be, let's say, that the ratio would be something, let's say, like 9 to 1. The presence of God meaning 9, and the absence of God, or the confusion of that He is Creator, as 1. That means that when Adam was created, Adam had a world of a superior Gilui Yehudoi. God hid Himself only to a small degree, not large, not greatly, only to a small degree, just enough to make the difference, just enough to allow Adam free will, just enough to give him a chance to choose God and bring him back. But how much did he have to bring him back? Only a small degree, because God only removed Himself a small degree. So the imperfection of the world was only minor. It was not large, and that was all that was necessary. That's why the condition of Gilui Yehudoi in the time of Adam, before he sinned, was a superior version of it. where the ratio of the presence to the absence of God, where that ratio was very large. What happened after Adam sinned? What happened? Well, after Adam sinned, the sin of Adam brought a darkness into the world. So in effect, what the sin of Adam did was to alter the ratio. That was the critical effect that Adam had. He therefore brought in a new condition into the world called kilkul. Kilkul is the exaggeration or the intensification of the absence of God. Kilkul means damage. Damage. So Adam therefore created a condition where there was an inferior Gilu Yechudoi, or an inferior revelation of God's presence. So that the ratio was much worse. The ratio was, let's say now, 8 to 2. The presence of God having gone down by 1 point and the absence having gone up by 1 point. But relative to what it was before the sin, it is an inferior mode. That is called a condition of Hester Yechudai, or the concealment of his unity. You see, Gil Yechudai means the revelation of God's existence or power. Hester Yechudai means the concealment of his unity or presence. It was a kilkul or a damage. So therefore, now the role of Adam Rishon, or the role of the first man, changed. Whereas it was Adam's job to remove or undo the original ratio and go from a state of a superior Gil Yechudai to a state of total Gil Yechudai. What's the ratio in the state of total Yechudai in Olam Haba? That's the state of what? Where P is what? 10 and A is 0. So Adam was supposed to go from a state of superior Gil Yechudai to a state of total Gil Yechudai, which is characterized by Olam Haba, where there is no at all absence or concealment of God at all, and that's man simcha. What he was supposed to do was go to that higher level. He was supposed to remove the chasan. He failed to do that. So what he did was lower the ratio, create an inferior Gil Yechudai, which is in essence a Hefsi Yechudai, concealment of his presence. That's what he did. Now, since Adam failed to go up and instead he went down, now he is 2 steps away from where he should have been. So Adam now has to occupy himself, or mankind rather, who is Adam's heirs or descendants, must now occupy themselves with undoing the damage that Adam did. They have to undo the kilkul, or the tumah that Adam brought into the world because of a sin. When Adam sinned, he brought in a tumah or an impurity into all physical substance and into all spiritual substance, so that the force of evil now resided in the physical world. That force of evil, which originally was only a seductive force, now was a power which literally was present in all the substance of reality, whereas before it was not present in that. The effect of that, the net effect of that, is to darken the world and create a much deeper version of God's absence. Much deeper. So therefore, we now have a period after a sin where Adam now, or his descendants, must undo the damage. That's called the tikkun of the kilkul. To remove the presence of evil in the substance of existence of the world. That's also called tahara, or purification. So the period now after the sin must be involved in essence with the period called, or the function called tahara, or the tikkun of the kilkul. You remember, Adam before he sinned was involved with the tikkun of the chasan. Adam simply had to remove the world from its inferior position. Now Adam must undo not the chasan or the imperfection, but he must undo the damage that his sin produced. The question that we have to ask is, if Adam sinned, and by sinning he lowered the ratio, means that the world was darker and God is more hidden, what is he achieving now? What's being achieved really? It's going to be harder for him to do mitzvahs. Harder. You see, so it seems to be more difficult. So, what must be the obvious answer to that? You ask me a question. Fine. You answer it. That's a very logical question. It must mean that what? The answer to that question must be the following. That, obviously, as the world gets darker and God goes further and further away from His world, it gets simpler, the task. That is the obvious answer. Wait. First, you must therefore state what the obvious answer is. Now, the question that you must ask right after that, well, why is that the case? That is then a separate question. But you must start from that position. When the Rebbeinu Shalom brought in more concealment because of the sin, he made things much simpler. I first want to teach you how to think. You see, the problem with many people when they think Hashkafa is they let their questions remain powerful barriers to understanding. One of the fastest ways to get an answer is to invert the question and to assume that that's the answer. And then, once they do that, they will automatically begin to turn their mind around to look at things from a different perspective. You see, that simply inversion itself is the beginning of a way, because it's going to reorient your mind. As long as you think that this way is the way downward, that more darkness in the world, you see, is a harder job, it'd be a barrier to anything. First you must make the premise. Wait a minute, obviously you must have made it easier. And then you have to begin to search how that makes easier. That itself would shift, you see, the way you can make to think of things. I'm not going to go into that answer. We will over time, but not right now. That is a very, very deep question, obviously, and that's a very fundamental question. What is God gaining by doing this? But the reason why all of you have suddenly become such intelligent Hashkafa people is because you are seeing Hashkafa from a different standpoint. You begin to see the rules of the game. And once you begin to see the rules of the game, and I mean, what game am I talking about? The game of Hashgacha, how God guides the world. Once you begin to see the rules of the game, now you begin to say, wait a minute, why do the rules appear that way? You see. Then you have graduated to the next level of Hashkafa. And you are no longer an elementary student. The first job in Hashkafa is to know what are the rules of the game. What are the essential principles that God uses as He guides the world from beginning to end. You don't know that, you can't start. Those are the elementary people, students. Once you know the full set of rules, then now you are in a position to begin to investigate what is the nature of those rules, what determines those rules to exist. What are they accomplishing, you see? That's already an intermediate level of Hashkafa. But Hashkafa, or the knowledge of God's providence, is a chokhmah. It's an understanding. And it's possible to understand it with great clarity. But you have to proceed logically and very precisely. So part of what I'm trying to do is not only to teach you the principles, but also how to think about the principles as well. There's another thing while I'm at it, since I'm into heuristics or how to think about principles, which is very, very important. I will tell you among the single most important things that to gain wisdom and understanding. You see, most people think that how do they become a chacham? How can they become a person who's wise and really knowledgeable and really understanding of the ways of the world and so on? So they think that thinking is simply the accumulation of facts. You open up a book and you read it, and suddenly you become a chacham. That's not what thinking is about at all. Thinking is the ability to process information, to take a certain number of facts and process it, attempt to analyze it, and then when you finish, to go on to the next series of facts and analyze it, and to begin to put together. That's what real thinking is about. Thinking is different than learning or reading. They're different activities. And the greatest weakness that mankind has, and that all the schools have, is that all the schools teach you how to learn, but they don't teach you how to think. That's a whole different skill. One of the critical principles or laws that are involved in thinking, and I will tell you it now, which allows anyone to really understand things deeper, is what's called the law of tolerance. I have named it the law of tolerance. And what that means is to be patient. You know what that means? That means the following. When you have a certain number of facts, it's very hard for people to do this. When you have a certain number of facts, you see, and with those facts you put it together and you come to a certain conclusion, let's say, based on those facts, and that conclusion does two things. Every new conclusion that you draw from a series of facts will always have two effects. The first effect, it will give you greater understanding, always. And the second effect, it will make you more confused. Because it will always alert you to new problems and to new issues. Always. Every resolution, you see, is the seed of new issues. Always. Because you go deeper and deeper. When you want to understand how to think, you always have to realize what these new issues are, and you have to be patient, you see. Because many people, because suddenly they begin to see new issues, they completely ignore the old resolution. So they will ignore a certain conclusion, because that conclusion now brings up new issues. And they will say, well, if new issues are brought up, the old conclusion must be wrong. Big mistake. The old conclusion could be 100% correct. And the reason why the new issues are brought up is because now you understand the matter much deeply. So you can understand and ask a much deeper question. You see? You see what I'm saying? Most people don't have the patience, so they throw the whole thing out. But that's a catastrophic error. Because part of the laws of thought is that as you understand more and more, you will have more and more questions. Here's a case in point. We analyzed the situation of Adam Rishon before and after the sin. And we saw, obviously, and I'm not saying this myself, that's what the Torah says. It got worse. It got darker. The ratio obviously changed. From, let's say, 9 to 1 to 8 to 2. This is obvious. So we see to ourselves, well, what happened over there? Why did God do that? Well, first of all, what is happening here? Obviously, we see a very thing that when man sins, the immediate effect is that the world gets darker. We understand, first of all, that what hinges on man sinning or not is to what degree God is present in the world. That's the critical factor which is being affected. That is a very important piece of information. Most people don't know this. So first you have to alert yourself to the principle. What exactly was Adam involved in before? What was the state of his being? What was the state of his mind? What was the state of the world? What was the condition of the world? The condition, in essence, is a ratio between how God appears in the world. That is a critical factor. And based on that, presence or absence, two sides to the question, we construct a ratio. And we say that obviously the condition of Adam Rishon before he sinned was nothing more than a statement of a certain ratio with respect to the most important factor of the world. Is God present or is he absent? Do you see what I'm saying? Fine. Now, we understand the critical factor which determines the condition of his state of being. Fine. He sins. Suddenly we see that factor has changed. We see the ratio is altered. So we observe, an important thing we observe, that the critical condition of a world is the ratio of Gilui to Hester. That is the most critical variable in all existence. There is nothing else more important. I don't care what you will say. There is nothing more important than that. That's number one. The second thing we observe is what affects that ratio. And what affects the ratio is sin or hate. Very interesting observation. The third thing we observe is how was the ratio affected? Did it go up or did it go down? It went down. So we see three things. The fact that there exists a ratio. Number two, that this ratio can be changed. Number three, what can change it? And number four, how it changes. Four precise pieces of information. Now, suddenly we understand a lot more than we understood before, don't we? But a new question comes up. Why does the ratio go down? Why doesn't it go up? Now, that's the new question. But you ask that new question because suddenly you become much more intelligent about what is going on. You see, that new issue is the result of a deeper understanding of what happened. So you might say, wait a minute, 1 second. Obviously, it got worse. Why would it get worse? Obviously, the task got harder. But why would it get harder? So let's throw the whole thing out. The critical factor is not Gilui and Hester. That's not the critical factor. Or maybe it didn't go down, maybe it went up. Do what you want. But suddenly the confusion leads to attempt to remove everything you've discovered till now. And that's a mistake. because everything you've discovered till now is correct. But it doesn't answer the question, why did the ratio go down? So, one of the most important ways to answer a question is by simply saying, that's the way. Assume it. It's not an issue, the issue is the resolution. You see? In other words, the fact that the world gets darker and that God disappears is the simplification of man's task. That's obviously what the answer is. So there's no more issue. The only problem is to understand why it's a resolution. But that will allow your mind to enter a new framework, you see. Now let's say you dig around and you work at it and you can't understand it. You try and figure out, what is it? You can't understand it. But what do? The obvious reason is to diagnose why you can't understand it. What is wrong? Who is the patient? The patient is the theory. The theory says that when man sins, the ratio gets worse, God hides further. That's the theory. But there's a symptom. The symptom is it doesn't make sense. You see. What's the resolution? The resolution is obviously, man, it's getting better. The fact that the world is getting darker and the condition is changing and the Hester is coming to the world means that things are getting simpler for man. Fine. We solved the problem. We don't understand the resolution. Why not? Because we don't have enough facts. So you know what you do? You put everything that you have up to that point in time, and then you say, and you write down your little problem on the side, and you wait. You wait till the time comes when suddenly new facts will emerge that can be understood in terms of the old information, and then suddenly it will hit you. It may not hit you right away. It may take 6 months to hit you. It may take 6 months. But if you do it methodically, the way I'm telling you, it will hit you. You see. What's critical in thinking is the second thing I'm doing. You see. Most people learn information. They remember it. Fine. They don't analyze it. They don't think into it. They don't see what that information is telling them. They simply go on. And then they learn new information. So that each new piece of information is essentially fragmented and isolated. Each thing standing on its own. That is a serious mistake, and that has nothing to do with thinking. If you want to think, this is what you do. First of all, you take a certain amount of facts, and you think about them. What is it telling me? What are the key ideas in these facts? You understand it, and then you see what new concepts come out of it, and what new issues come out of it. And you can only go so far. You suddenly get a new bunch of facts. Now what do you do with the new bunch of facts? What you do with the new bunch of facts is the following. You analyze it and understand what information is coming from it. But you do something else. You look at the new bunch of facts, or group of facts, in its relationship to the old group of facts. That is the key thing. Most people never do that. In other words, based on the way I understood something till now, what do these new series of facts tell me? Does it modify my old thinking? Does it change it? It doesn't affect it? How is it relating to my old type of thinking? You see. And what usually does is it will force a modification of the old type of thinking. So that suddenly the picture emerges somewhat new. You see. And then new issues will come up, and then you will write those issues down. And you will wait for the third set of facts. And you will do this constantly, so that each new set of facts is analyzed and then observed in terms of how it affects the old conclusion. You see, whether or not some of the old issues can be resolved by the new series of facts. You see, that's how real thinking takes place. That's how real thinking takes place. You see. And this, in essence, is what we're doing here. We're observing what the critical situation is with others. We're observing what is happening, and we're seeing what new questions come out. Now the question why the ratio here will be affected downwardly is not known now, because we don't have enough information to deal with it. So you've got to put aside, and you've got to be tolerant and patient until the time comes when there will be a set of facts that would reveal that. Okay, now that I've given this talk, let's go back to the original thing. Sometimes you people look at the board and you look at what I'm saying and you say to yourself, where did he get that information from? Why is it that he can see all this information from these couple of facts? And I've read this 1,000 times. And I've heard it in different lectures or whatever it is, and I've never quite seen it that way. What does he have that I don't have and that other people don't have, that only Peter really has? The answer is, you have to think right. That's really what it is. You've got to know how to analyze a series of facts. That's all it is. You see. Okay, now, let's look at the situation. The situation here is, Adam after the sin is in a peculiar circumstance. After the sin, Adam now is involved in a whole different ratio where God's presence now is limited, much lower degree than it was before. It's still very high, you see. Now, what happens after Adam? After Adam, now Adam must be involved with Tahara, or removing the damage, or the aggravated decrease in the ratio. What happens if Adam fails? His children have to do it, and their children have to do it. So that each generation has the task of removing the damage that was done to that ratio. That ratio is all of Olam Haba. That's the purpose of man. Each generation must fix that ratio. If it fails, then the task is given over to the next generation. And if that generation fails, to the next, and so on. And that, in essence, is what all of human history is about. All of human history is nothing more than a continued attempt to what? To remove or to restore that ratio to what it was to Adam before he sinned, by removing the damages. Now, as each generation fails, it increases the damage. So the ratio gets worse, and worse, and worse. In other words, every time you attempt to fix that ratio and you fail, you must make that ratio worse. You see, you can't leave it neutral. Like, you can't leave it unaffected. It's got to get worse and worse and worse. So that, over the course of human history, it goes down and down and down. Now, what the Buddhism says is, I will allot a certain amount of time for you to restore that ratio. I will give you a certain period of time. And that ratio must be restored by that time. That is called, the 6,000-year period. What God said was that eventually, you must restore the damage of Adam Rishon. You must restore the damage that he did to the ratio, plus his job of the original ratio. Remember, Adam was created with a ratio of, let's say, 9 to 1. Adam was supposed to take that ratio of 9 to 1 from 10 to 0. Instead, he brought it down from 8 to 2. So God says, I will allow mankind 6,000 years to bring it back from wherever it is up to where? To 10 to 0. See? I will give mankind 6,000 years to do what Adam failed to do, and to undo all the damage that's done in the attempt to rectify the situation. 6,000 years, that's the magic number. Right now we are on 5,747, you see. And we have still failed to do it, you see. Therefore, we are still in the period of inferior Gila Yehudo, with this enormous Hester. We are still involved in the job of the Tikkun of the Kilkel. You see. That's what we're involved in. What happens if mankind succeeds? What happens if suddenly, in one generation, man removes the damage or the kilkor, and restores what? The world back to the ratio of Adam Rishon. Incredible. What happens if he does that? If he does that, we all throw a big party. And you know what that party is called? That party is called the advent of the Mashiach. That is the Messianic triumph. When mankind achieves the level where that damage is removed and the ratio is restored to what Adam had before, that is the Yemot Mashiach. Now we begin to understand something really interesting and important. Wait a minute. We said before that the Yemot Mashiach is characterized by an essential feature that the awareness of God is much greater than this today. Yes, that's true. But is the awareness of God in the time of the Mashiach the same as it will be in the time of Olam Haba? No, not at all. Obviously not at all. Why not? Because the awareness of God in the time of the Mashiach will be like it was in Adam before he sinned. which means we will go back up to 9 to 1. But it is not the total level we can achieve, because we still have to go to a point where it is 10 to 0, which means that the Yemot Mashiach is nothing more than the equivalent period of Adam was before he sinned. That's all it is. And we have the additional task of the Tikkun of the Chassan, the additional task of removing the imperfection, going from 9 to 1 to 10 to 0. By the time we get to the Yemot Mashiach, we will have achieved the Tikkun of the Kilkul, or the removal of the damage. We will remove the incredible inferior mode of Gil Yechudai. We will restore the superior mode of Gil Yechudai. But we will not restore the total mode, because that is Olam Haba. But that means that even in the Yemot Mashiach, man still has free will, doesn't it? And it means that there will still be the ability to do sins and chatoim, even when the Mashiach is around, except that it will be at a much more minor degree. Do we see this? Very interesting. So even though the Torah says that at the time of the Mashiach, there will be incredible awareness of God's presence, it will not be like Olam Haba. It will simply be like Adam was before he sinned. That's what it will be like. And that's the critical concept. But to get to a level where there is no more free will, where there's no more ability to cloud God, or to evict God, or for God to withdraw, that will be the position of Olam Haba. And that's the Tikkun of the Chassan, or the Tikkun of the entire condition of the Yetzer and the Nachash. So, looking at the diagram, you see the entire thing. Before the sin of Adam, we had the condition of superior Gil Yechudai, 9 to 1 ratio. And the essential task was to remove that ratio, and that's called the Tikkun of the imperfection of Chatan. He failed, he damaged, so he brought the world into an inferior mode of Gil Yechudai, a lower ratio, let's say 8 to 2, where there's a great condition of Hester, or concealment. Now he's involved in removing the damage, or Kilkul. So therefore, his chief task, him and his descendants, are what's called the Tikkun of the Kilkul, or the Tahara of the world, the purification of the world. If that is achieved, by who? By any generation that can do it. Any generation that can do it. Suddenly, it will usher in again the period of the world, the condition of the world, as it existed with Adam before he sinned. It will restore the world to a situation or a condition of superior Gil Yechudai, as it was in the time of Adam before he sinned. And we will again become involved with what? The task of Tikkun of the Chassan, or raising that ratio up to its total level. You see, finally, when we succeed doing that, we will then go into a condition called Olam Haba. And that will be a total Gil Yichud, where the revelation of God's presence is absolute, and that goes on for all time. And the ratio is being obviously 10 to 0. You see this? Do we understand the course of human history and the conditions or the phases of human history depending on what man does? So we see in so many very critical ideas that the critical factor in the creation of the world is what is the condition of God's presence? Meaning, what is the condition of man's awareness of his presence? That's the key factor. What is the level of his gilui? That submits to a ratio. The fundamental task of man, or his purpose, is to in some way manipulate that ratio. He can either manipulate it up or down. Depending on how he manipulates it, that will determine the course of events. In essence, if you think about it, if you understand the concept that one man was created, the question is, why was only one man created for such a short period of time to accomplish this entire task? And the answer is really obvious, because the truth of the matter is, what does God want? God wants to create one being outside of himself or other than himself to be the recipient of eternal life. One consciousness is all that's necessary, especially the fact that one man really included all men. That's it. The Buddha wants to be made to create a neshama of an extraordinary stature. The neshama of Adam Rishon, the soul of Adam Rishon before he sinned, was really the composite of every soul that was ever created after. Because all people, all of mankind, from the time of the sin of Adam until the end of time, are all fragments of Adam's original neshama. It was all one collective neshama. And the Banisham only needed or felt in some way that only one neshama would do that. No more is really necessary. The question isn't why God created one person. The question is, why does God need any more than one? That's really the fundamental issue. If the Banisham wants to do good, and he wants to create the recipient of his goodness, one being is all that's necessary. That's it. Now, the question is, why do we have more people than one? Because Adam sinned. Now, the other question becomes much more powerful. Well, once you begin to sin, you see, and the world begins to proliferate with more and more neshamas, meaning that the neshamas are constantly fragmented from each generation and so on and so forth, where do you stop? What stops the line? If we say that 6,000 years is the amount of time that God allotted for the task to be fulfilled, that means that there's a certain given number of neshamas that can be constructed or fragmented until that time. Why that number? Call that number X. Whatever it is. I don't know. 8 billion, whatever you want to call that. Why would God stop with that point? Why? And obviously he has to stop the point because 6,000 is the full number. That is the question. And the question is, that is a deep mystery. An incredibly deep mystery. In order to answer that, you've got to have a lot more information than we have here. And the truth is, I have to have a lot more information than I have at this point. Because that is one of the biggest questions of all. You see. Because in essence what we're saying is, why did God assign 6,000 years as the ultimate limit? And why does he fragment the souls in just this particular fashion? You see. That's really the very, very hidden knowledge that goes into the design of existence itself. So in essence what we have to do is pierce into God's mind, so to speak, kaviyachol, and attempt to understand the internal design. Now the question is, can we do it? Is it a lack of knowledge? In other words, theoretically, if we're all smart enough, can we figure out that answer? Or does that answer lie at a point which is beyond knowing? That's a very interesting question, isn't it? I always characterize those questions as what's called south of the border or north of the border. With the border or the margin being those things that have to do with the essence of God, and those things that have to do, anything north of the border is the essence of God himself, as he exists unto himself. Everything over that border, south of the border, has to do with the world that he created. You see, we can pierce into the world, and we can go deeper and deeper and deeper. But it depends on where that information takes us. If that information takes us to a point over the border, we can never know it. It is unknowable. Because to know it is to be God. But if it is south of the border, then it is possible to know it, albeit through intense mental activity. And I mean intense. You see. Now, if you ask me the question, what is this question? Is it south of the border or is it north of the border? You see, based on what I'm saying, I would imagine that part of it is south and part of it is north. I would imagine. But I would think that there is definitely a select amount of information that we can know. We can answer this question to a much deeper degree than we have here. We definitely can. But to do that, we've got to go into the laws of existence and the laws of mind or consciousness, which is obviously beyond this year. But I believe that it can be answered. But that's a very good question. You know, the interesting point is, and what we see here, and it's a very critical thing, you know, and it's not as easy as the following, and let me just amplify this thing. The thing that we see is that the universe appears to be expanding. Things seem to be getting more and more and more quantitatively. So we find this in a very strange concept here. The very strange concept that suddenly there's a limit, there's a time limit. Suddenly everything would stop at a certain point in time. It's a very unusual concept that we're dealing with, that everything suddenly stops in 6,000 years. You see. So of course the answer is, why does it stop at that point? But I want you to know something, that question is not as, that concept is not as mysterious as you think, or is not as strange as you think. I'll explain to you why. Physics itself, astronomy itself, shows us that the world is discontinuous and not continuous. What do I mean? Scientists have always asked themselves, What do I mean by first? Continuous means a process that goes on without end. Discontinuous means a process which will stop at a certain point in time. You see. Now, how do we know if a process is continuous or discontinuous? Well, the answer is, let's look at the beginning. If you want to know if the end is going to go on or not, let's look at the beginning. Obviously, any process which is continuous, which goes on forever, obviously must have been going on forever. If a process is discontinuous, it's going to stop. You see, it's more than likely that the process started at a certain point. You see what I'm saying? There's a symmetry here. Something which starts at a certain point in time can easily stop at a certain point in time. But something that always was there will probably always continue to be there. You see? Wait a minute. Wait, please. If we look at the physical universe, scientists always want to understand the universe itself. The universe is expanding. Scientists have discovered that all the galaxies, which are compositions of stars, each galaxy has about 100 billion stars in it. It's a cluster. And scientists have discovered about 100 billion galaxies in the universe. And when they look at all these different clusters of stars called galaxies, they see a very strange thing, that all these galaxies are receding, or they're moving further and further away from each other. So what they see is that the universe is expanding. An amazing thing. They discovered this a while back, about 50, 60 years ago. It's called the expanding universe. That's what they thought. It's an expanding universe. Well, they said to themselves, logically, wait a minute, if the universe is expanding, if it's getting bigger and bigger, you see, then obviously it must have started at a certain point in time. So what they did was, logically, is play the entire thing backwards. And they tried to figure out when it started, and what it was like when it started, you see. So they squeezed it all back, like they run a motion picture backwards, and they saw that it all started, that the universe, incredibly, was once a infinitesimal dot. Yeah, that's all the matter of the universe was condensed into one infinitesimal dot, and suddenly it expanded, began the expansion. You see, they called that point in time when the universe suddenly was one dot. I don't know if you know what they call it. They call it the Big Bang, and it's obviously why it's a Big Bang. Now, if you ask scientists why the universe was in the form of a suddenly an infinitesimal dot and suddenly expanded, big problem, because they don't know. It doesn't make sense. Why does it start this way? You see, why does it start this way and suddenly begin to expand? They don't know. Nobody knows. But it's clearly that's the way it was. Okay. But the scientists will try and get out of it another way. They'll say, wait a minute. We all know that it started from a Big Bang. But the question is, where is it going? It's expanding. But wait, will it continue to expand? Or will eventually it's going to slow down, stop, and make a reverse? Hey, not a bad way to get around it. You see, what scientists need to do, what scientists who don't want to believe in God need to do, is show that the universe is continuous. Because something that goes on forever must have lasted forever. Hence, there cannot be any God who made it. You see? Wait, please. Therefore, it's important to demonstrate that the world is continuous. Because a continuous world means a world that was always there. A world that's always there, shoot, we don't need God. A world where we don't have God, I can do whatever I want. That's the bottom line. So there are big problems, because when you look at an expanding world, obviously the world started from a small point. That would indicate that the world is discontinuous. So they get around it by saying, wait a minute, hey, wait a minute. The world is expanding, but it's getting slower and slower. And as it slows down, it stops, and it'll begin to go back to the point. Once it hits the point again, it'll begin to expand. And once it goes up to a certain point, it'll go back. So you have like an accordion. Big bang to maximum expansion, back to the Big Bang. You know what I mean? Back and forth. Well, that itself is a continuous process, isn't it? So, the fact that the world started at a dot is alright. Because what will happen is the world will start at a dot, expand to its end point, go back to the dot, and then expand again for the end of time, you see. Now, why the world does that, nobody knows. But that kind of world doesn't need a God, because that kind of world continues on its own. You see? But what they're discovering is very bad information. Because by virtue of new things that they discovered recently, they see that the world is not going to go back. it's going to continuously go on. In other words, what they're discovering is, and I won't go into the physics of it, because there's not enough math to draw it back. They're discovering the following, that the world is expanding forever. It's going to just keep on going on and on and on. That means that the world started from a point and will go on and expand forever. Now that is a discontinuous world. Because it's a world which suddenly started, you see, and a world which will go on, but it's a world which suddenly started. From what? From an infinitesimal dot. For some reason, the world started. Now, that is incredibly consistent with the Torah, isn't it? Because the Torah said that the world started at a certain point. That's mamash what the Torah says. And the Torah says that the world started at a certain point in time, and it did not start before that, which is obvious from the physical universe. You see, in other words, it's clear to scientists that at the point when the entire universe was concentrated in a one dot, there was no before that. That's when it was. It started at a certain point, and nobody can explain it. Now, what does that have to do with us? What that has to do with us is very simply. We see that from the physical world, the world started at a certain point in time, and the world is expanding, going on, and it looks like it could go on forever. But suddenly Judaism comes on and says, no, the world will not go on forever. You see, so you come up with the question, wait a minute, the world looks like it's going on forever, it looks like it's continuous. So the answer is, just like the world started at a point in time, the world will end at a point in time. Don't think that the world is going to go on and on and on. There'll be more and more people. Mankind will go on and on and on and on. It's not what it's going to be. It looks that way. But just as you understand that the world started at a point in time and wasn't always there in some kind of continuous cycle, but it started at the beginning, so it will be with the Hashgacha, that God created the world at a certain point in time, and it will end it at a certain point in time. You see? And that the physics of the world itself demonstrates that fact. And no matter what scientists try to do to get out of it in whichever way they cannot get out of that fact. You see? The question that we can ask, why does it end at a certain point in time? And why that point in time? Why does God choose to end it in the year 6000? Why? That's obviously a very difficult question, you see. But the more fundamental question is that the world will end, you see. And how do we know that it will end? And the Baruch Shem says, I will show you in the physical world itself that it will end. I will demonstrate it to you. Because physical existence is not continuous. It didn't start in the beginning from the end of time and go on to the end of time. But it started at a moment in time, and it will stop at a moment in time. The question is, are there other planets with people? Or is this the only, we people, mankind, are the only people in which God wants to fulfill His ultimate purpose? And what we know from the Kabbalah, from the Ari, from Yitzhak Luria and the Kabbalah, is that this is the only period. And that's it. That there is no other period. There are other types of creatures in the world. Yes. There are other types of existences. There are angels and there are Shadim. There are other kinds of demons. There are other kinds of entities in the world. But as far as we know two things. That mankind is the being who God wants to what? Achieve his objective through man. Number one. And that mankind is essentially represented on the planet Earth and nowhere else. Again, there are two things that we know. That man, or the human species, is the species who will fulfill the purpose of what God wants. Only man. That means only mankind has free will. You see, there are other creatures in the world, but they don't have free will. And they don't have to do with this ratio of the presence or absence of God. Only man has to do with that ratio. And that mankind only exists on the planet Earth. And essentially nowhere else. In fact, there are some people who think that God created, because it says in certain places that God created several worlds and then destroyed them. So some people think that God created a number of different versions of mankind. And what the Ari or Yitzhak Luria says is that that's not true. This is the only version of mankind who essentially will fulfill the objective of God as we know it. So here we have a couple of absolutes that we can deal with based on what the Torah says. Okay, we have the overview of human history. Interesting, isn't it? But wait a minute, we see some very interesting things. And I want to bring out certain facts, certain very basic principles, which are very, very deep. First of all, if you're really listening carefully, you can begin to come up with some new issues. You see. Wait, 1 second. Let's look at what I just said. We said that other Rishon started with the ratio, lowered the ratio, and that we've got to go back. We will go back, and when we do get back, that will be the Messianic period. Sounds good. Fine. And we know that after the Messianic period comes Olam Haba. But there's one big problem. Wait a minute. If Adam Rishon failed, if he fell, and because of the fact he fell, he altered the ratio, what is there to prevent us from going back down again? In other words, we can have a Mashiach come back, because we've done the job, we've raised the Gilu level of the world, fine, everything is back to where Adam was before the sin, and bingo! We sin again, and we've got to go back down. In fact, we've done it before. At the time of the Egel, at the time when the Jews left Egypt, they were supposed to enter into a Messianic period. Now I will get into that concept a little later. But basically, a little beforehand, the fact is that the Jews leaving Egypt were supposed to initiate the period of the Mashiach. What does that mean? Now we understand something very deep. It works backwards. It's not that the Mashiach suddenly comes and suddenly there's a new Gilu level. It's backwards. It's that suddenly all mankind has produced a new Gilu level and then the Mashiach comes. You see how it works? You understand? It's backwards. It's because of the fact that we have altered the ratio that we schlepped the Mashiach here. The Mashiach is nothing more than an indicator that we've done our job well. But wait a minute. If we were successful in schlepping the Mashiach here, why can't we get rid of him also? When the Jews went out of Egypt, they received the Torah, they were supposed to start the Messianic time. Who was their Mashiach supposed to be? Moshe Rabbeinu, among others. What happened? They worshipped the golden calf. And that sin destroyed the ability of those people to what? To bring the Messianic period, which means that the people who left Egypt did the exact same thing that Adam Rishon did. What's called a critical chef. Any sin which can damage the world in terms of impeding or obstructing the ability of the world to go to a higher level of Giloy and not allowing Mashiach to come is called a critical sin. There are a lot of little sins you can do, but the big granddaddy of them all is the one that killed the entire situation. That's the critical sin. That critical sin was done by Adam, and that critical sin was also done by the Jews who left Egypt. And they destroyed the situation, so again it went back down. So then why is this period any better? Why? Why can't we do it? Now you may say, well maybe we will do it. Maybe we will what? We will again destroy the situation. Yes, we won't. Because that is the promise of the Mashiach. The promise of the Mashiach is that we will get there. And that once we get there, we will stay there. That is the essence of the promise. Listen to what I just said. The essence of the promise is that once we get there, we will stay there. Once the Mashiach comes, we cannot undo it. Now, that sounds like a fascinating concept, which immediately brings in a new problem. Hold on. Did you not say that in the time of the Mashiach, all the people will have free will, even though it will be a small amount? Did you not say that in the time of the Mashiach, people will still be able to do sins? If that's the case, what is the result of sin? The result of a sin is to what? It's to always alter the ratio. So, the people who live in the time of the Mashiach will be able to do sins, and they should be able to alter the ratio. Yet we know that if people do sins in the time of Mashiach, that ratio will not be altered. Problem. Big problem. Here is another one of the biggies in Ashkafa. Why won't it be altered? Obviously, something radical will change. Something incredibly radical will change. So that the very foundation of what a sin does will change. Obviously, a sin which is done in the time of Mashiach will not have the same effect as a sin which is done you see, before the Mashiach comes. Because before the Mashiach comes, a sin has the ability to alter the ratio and lower the Gilui. After the Mashiach comes, a sin does not have effect. The question is, why not, and what effect does it have? But that's a fascinating problem, isn't it? Put it on the burner.
However, it's slower.
But that is a very important fact. You see, now you understand two things. You understand a very, very important thing. I have given you precise definitions of what will happen when Mashiach comes. Number one, I have told you that the appearance of the Mashiach really is what conforms with the appearance of a new level of Gilui. Number two, that level of Gilui has already existed in the time of Adam, and it is simply a repetition of what once existed before. And number three, that level of Gilui can never again be altered. In that way, the Messianic Gilui is different than the Adam Gilui. You see, in that way it's different. Even though the Gilui will be similar in the time of Mashiach to the time of Adam Rishon before he sinned, the one critical difference is what? Is that we cannot do what Adam did, because a sin will no longer have the effect of altering the ratio. That is the substantial difference between the Messianic period and what's called the pre-sin period, before Adam sinned. Let me reiterate what I said before. In the time of the Mashiach, we will have a Yetzer Hara, and there will be some free will, but very little left. Why? Because we will have a similar kind of situation that Adam had before he sinned. Remember, where the ratio was 9 to 1? That means there was a very tiny little Yetzer Hara. That's all there was. There was a very tiny Yetzer Hara there. When we have the time of the Mashiach, we will again restore ourselves to that Yetzer Hara. The difference is that the consequence of the sin, that the consequence of the sin of Adam, you see, was the fact that he destroyed the ratio, or altered it. Whereas we will not be able to alter it again once the Mashiach appears.